welcome to the NGRT studio. We are located at the CTICC Africa Utility Week 2014, and we have two speakers this time, first day of our conference. First of all, I think I'm just going to introduce you as you speak, but firstly I've got James Arnott. You're the Managing Director, Resources of Accenture, Capital Project Services.
That's correct, yes.
Hayley, I'll introduce you, and then I'm just going to go back again and we'll take the conversation from there. Hayley Walters is the Managing Director of Operations and Innovation, Management Consulting Portfolio Lead. It's quite a, did I get it all in? Of Accenture. So this should prove to be a really interesting conversation. You are sort of global perspective, and Hayley is more of an African perspective. So feel free to interject when you see the need. Okay, when you see the need arise. The first question that I just wanted to ask you, James, is, what is your role on a global perspective, and then I'm going to ask Hayley her perspective on the company's role.
So within the Accenture business, we have a capability that effectively helps our clients, typically the owner-operator, to facilitate or better execute their capital project portfolio. And what that means is that we have a look in terms of how Accenture can be relevant to our clients in the areas of outsourcing, systems integration or management consulting within the capital project context. And that typically tends to revolve around things like the engineering data management components and the associated document management, the execution of capital projects from a project management office perspective, the portfolio management, the risk management, and in many cases for a number of clients to provide a set of functional services as they build and develop and evolve their capital projects, particularly in geographic domains that are challenged around education, local workforce, capability, etc. Because everybody has an expectation of a world-class project, utilizing world-class tools, etc.
There's generally a lot of money involved as well, so
indeed,
you need to make sure it works from the outset.
And so my role is to help our account teams better understand our offering as Accenture and our clients in terms of what we have to offer, and then to bring a set of thought leadership from other geographies, other industries, and how we can apply them in a local context.
Now your focus is global. So you were saying, what are the areas, the regions that you focus on?
So I look after Europe, Africa, Latin America, and that also includes the Middle East.
Okay. I was speaking to somebody earlier. Risk management is apparently a big keyword at the conference at the moment, and there's a few white papers that are going around that I'm chewing into today. And it would appear that risk management has perhaps maybe been overlooked in a lot of projects, and there's certain parts of the project that are not being looked at in a holistic point of view. And there are gaps, and money is being lost, and projects are perhaps failing because there isn't sufficient risk management. Is that a trend that you're seeing across the board because projects are becoming so much more complex now, so many more role players?
Sure. So let me answer the question slightly differently, but I will answer your question. Yeah. We did some research on the execution of capital projects within the utilities industry.
Yes.
And from the research, the various organizations said that there were three key challenges that they faced in executing capital projects. The first was the ability to understand or work within a regulatory environment that is sometimes misunderstood or emerging from a capability perspective. The second issue was associated with the ability to find talent, both in order to be able to execute the build and also the ability to be able to run the build of the asset once it was created. And then the third aspect was spending more time in terms of doing better front-end loading associated with how to actually execute the project. If we put the risk management paradigm on top of that, you can see that in actual fact, having a good risk management strategy means that we better understand the regulatory environment and the associated pros and cons and what we can do about it. Or we can understand what we can do from a talent perspective, from a risk perspective, or from a planning perspective. So I think that risk is one of those themes that is essential to everything. I think it'd be hard to kind of pull it out separately, but to understand how risk mitigation can potentially work across a variety of disciplines, domain areas, etc.
Do you think that if there was less risk involved and it was proven by a particular company, do you think that it would be more bankable? The bankability levels would increase, that investors would come running and banks would come running to invest. Do you think that that's a major issue? Is that because there's risk involved?
Sure. So I think when we look at risk, we look at the probability versus the impact, and as kind of a 2-by-2 quadrant. in most organizations, they'll have a capital project lifecycle model, and they will move the project through various stages.
Yes.
And in each of those stages, they will develop a risk profile associated with whether or not the project does or doesn't become bankable.
Right.
I think the challenge around the risk discipline is the associated maturity, or alternatively the optimism that people have. You know, the project becomes important to the individual, important to the organization, and sometimes the clarity or the ability to accurately interrogate a risk, be almost clinical in it, is sometimes not as well done as it could be. And I think that's wherein lies the challenge. You know, so the bankability gets undermined as a consequence of organizational ownership, etc.
Yes.
And so, you know, I think we think of donor organizations that provide funding, particularly into Africa, around a number of projects. Then the maturity of risk, or having a third party effectively validate the risk, becomes the mechanism that's often put in place.
So outsourcing is quite a good option, you know, for utilities to follow, just because it does make it more sort of objective. You have a clearer perspective of what the risks really are, if they are, well, they generally are. Because perhaps maybe talent isn't there, maybe in certain regions, there's a bit of a skills gap there maybe?
Yes, I think, you know, organizations like ours, this is Accenture, you know, will provide a mechanism by which the risk can be, you know, assessed against a variety of other factors, or potentially bring in other factors. At the same time, you know, to your point that you made, it's, you know, in part it's skill, but also it's in part the maturity of the discipline that may exist within an organization.
Okay. Because things are changing really. You know, there are new trends taking place in the electricity industry, and I think Africa is probably the biggest region undergoing major change at the moment. And you know, the talent gap, the skills gap is clearly a major issue, so outsourcing is quite important, it's quite critical. Hayley, can you expand on that at all with regards to having to outsource? You know, how critical is that?
So just to bring, just in terms of my role,
yes.
So within the broader global organisation and the capital projects, in Africa we've got a very focus on capital projects and on infrastructure development.
Yes.
And so beyond the owner-operator, we're also looking to support the service providers to the owner-operator. So those companies that are building the locomotives or helping the independent power producers, also doing some of their build and their construction.
Yes.
And so risk takes on a different perspective, and outsourcing takes on a very different perspective, because where the African continent is, while there has been some investment in infrastructure through PIDA and through locally in South Africa through our PRCC agenda, we still are at the advantage of taking the risks that we've learned around the global entities and bringing those to Africa and taking those risks and building them in to our planning as we plan out the infrastructure programs and the capital investment programs in this country and on the continent. From an outsourcing point of view, I think that the benefits that you have of bringing in an outsourced provider is that much of the work done on the continent is done by a consortium. It's a group of parties that it's not just an owner-operator scenario where you build for the operator. So if we look at even in the rail infrastructure development program in South Africa, you know, there are a multitude of parties involved, and bringing in and outsourcing certain aspects, not only risk, but also helping do some of the integrated planning, looking at some of the supply development programs and the localization programs. I think there are multiple avenues where someone like Accenture can help from an outsourcing point of view.
How easy is it for a company like Accenture to actually access the market in Africa? Have you come up against any challenges, obstacles that you'd like to share, and how are you overcoming them?
I'm not sure that they're unique challenges to Accenture accessing the market. I think that the infrastructure and capital programs in Africa have additional complexities to some of the complexities that we would have experienced in our global research. You know, our regulatory framework, taxes, and getting funding. We're not necessarily building against a business case to generate cash. We're actually building against business cases for economic development, for the development of the population, so there's a social aspect to it. So getting the funding from the World Bank and other such institutions has a very different set of criteria, and therefore you monitor it against a set of different criteria. Obviously within the regulatory framework, the political stability are all factors that influence Africa much more so than in many other places that we've done research. And so, you know, I think that the challenge that maybe Accenture as a service provider
Yes.
is probably not unique to Accenture. It's the challenge to the infrastructure and capital build programs in Africa.
Okay, all right. And I mean, they will be easily overcome as experience is pulled upon from various parts of the world. I mean, has Africa got a lot to learn, you know?
I mean, I think Africa has a lot to offer.
Yes.
And
yes,
I think
certainly
that,
does.
you know, our success will be determined in terms of how well we are able to take that capability, harness it.
Yeah.
You know, we have a great opportunity in terms of the South African power pool, the interconnectedness of the grids, etc., to facilitate sub-Saharan African growth. But it requires, constructive relationships between governments, for example. It requires the ability for the actual infrastructure to be put down, and so on. We have the ability, with Angola, Mozambique, more recently with the oil and gas, for example, to be able to introduce other components into the energy mix from a gas perspective. We have, Nigeria now becoming the largest African economy as such. The role that it's going to play, its challenge associated with providing its own electricity demands given its growing population. Somebody mentioned in the plenary this morning about, Nigerian citizens generate their own electricity, but that electricity generation happens as a base of consuming the oil. And so, we'll see as the economic growth develops, people become richer, they'll consume more local oil, and that will create a challenge for them from a country perspective. So, their growth will be determined by that. So I think, there's a lot to offer. There's a lot to get right. I think, to the point that Hayley was making about the consortium approach, about being able to draw on a number of capabilities. And then I think the caveat to your question about outsourcing will also be, what is the local content expectation?
Yes.
We have to ensure that the capital build develops new economies, develops the supply chain, develops the actual citizens of the country, etc. And I think that's the role that government will play in terms of creating that platform for broader economic development.
I mean, at the end of the day, government's got to be on board, and if they're not on board, a lot of projects are going to fall flat. Have you found that that's maybe, as far as regulation is concerned, especially from an Africa perspective, there's this perception that it's sometimes a bit tricky to do business within Africa, not just because of conflict in some regions, but just from a regulation point of view, maybe set aside finance for the moment, but just from a regulatory point of view and politics point of view, is it really that difficult to get in there? I mean, is it getting easier?
I think, if you look at South Africa,
Yeah.
in terms of the PRCC agenda,
Yes.
I think that the government is very committed to the infrastructure
Yeah.
development of the country.
Makes a huge
They
difference.
understand the economic impact that it will have.
Yeah.
And I think that it is mandatory,
Yes.
actually, for private enterprise and for private partnerships to support the government's agenda. They're there, they've provided the finance, they've provided the governance and the infrastructure to do that. Now we need private enterprises to really come and help
Yes.
develop our certain local industry sectors.
And they're willing.
And they're willing, and we've already seen a couple of really good success stories both in our utilities area and within the rail sector. And I think if we
Fantastic.
look and take the South African focus of government and we look broader outside of South Africa as we go into sub-Saharan Africa,
Right.
I think there are like governments who have got the investment set aside, they've attracted the funding, and now it's up to the right partnerships to come and private enterprise to come and actually support the agenda of the build
Yes.
program, but at the same time leaving a local industry that can continue to will continue the build and also then maintain
which is
the
going to provide the
utilities
jobs,
going
local jobs, which are so needed on the continent, and skills
And,
development as well.
James was talking earlier about the Nigerian example of private households generating their own
Yes.
their own power. Well, that's all good and well, but that doesn't necessarily contribute to the social agenda. It doesn't contribute to the economic stimulation of the
And it's
country.
probably not very sustainable, though, is it?
Well, it's sustainable for the small households, but
short-
households are only such a small portion
Yes.
of the utility, of the power usage, of the energy
Yes.
usage. So I think it's really important from a government's point of view to focus on the social agenda, absolutely, but it's got to also be intertwined with the economic development of the country. So if you're going to stimulate manufacturing, we have all the global consumer goods companies wanting footprints in Africa, all making big dollar investments in building up new manufacturing plants, brewing, etc.
Yeah.
They need the utilities, the water, the power, etc., to be able to do that manufacturing for the consumer.
there's an incredibly exciting trend overseas. We're writing a lot about microgrids, energy storage. It's very exciting overseas. Spain, UK, Germany. A lot of people are going off-grid. And I read recently that there is a mine in the Limpopo region that has actually now developed a solar farm, and they're going off-grid. Do you see this trend, developing as time goes by? Do you think that the utility needs to change its business model?
So I think the off-grid is a double-edged sword.
Yes.
By virtue of the fact that the ability to maintain that off-grid requires a set of skills, etc., and an expectation associated with the maintenance, which may not be provided by the national utility. So there is an opportunity for small maintenance organizations, etc., to do that. But the challenge of off-grid as well, and if we look at places like Germany, the Netherlands, etc., has been that self-electrification has created challenges associated with the baseload expectation, that there's always the expectation that the utility will provide the baseload, but potentially puts the utility at risk from a financial perspective because it's difficult to maintain it. And then on the other side of that, we have the challenge associated with the management of the actual grid operation, that what grid operators want is consistency associated with supply. So a day when the sun shines brightly and the wind blows is a nightmare for or countries that have self-generation, because all of a sudden there's excess capacity on the grid and it doesn't get stored, etc. So I think off-grid, again, like the self-generation, provides some opportunities, but the actual interoperability and the connectedness of the network is going to be the key challenge.
Integration is going to be a big challenge, and I think that's where energy storage solutions are just going to be such a game changer within the energy industry. So it's going to be interesting to see where Africa goes with regards to that. With big mines, big industries, going off grid. It will be interesting to see how those projects, are funded and how they go forward. To both of you. What are you seeing at the conference? Is there a particular trend, opportunity, disappointment? Perhaps you've seen something that has not developed as quickly as you'd hoped. What is your perception so far? We're only a couple of hours into the conference, but I'm sure you've picked up something along the way.
So perhaps two perspectives.
Yeah.
I think if we look just around us on the floor,
yes.
The significant number of service providers that are here,
yes.
actually understanding that there is an African energy agenda. And I think that is heartening to understand in terms of the opportunity, etc. I think, based on this morning's discussion from the plenary perspective, the word that I came with was this notion of collaboration, the need to collaborate around standards, the need to collaborate in terms of inter-country trade associated with energy, the need to collaborate associated with lessons learned, etc. And so perhaps we'll see that continue through the course of the next 2 days. Who knows?
Pull in all the resources and make it a better place. Hayley, anything from your side?
I think my key observation is, again, lots of interesting service providers. We started with a plenary session this morning.
Yes.
Some very interesting, very discrete views around water, around power.
Yes.
And I think we've got to find a way to bring the integration. And I think that's where the role that Accenture plays as a service provider onto the continent, and as a service provider into the capital projects and infrastructure space, is we bring that holistic perspective of the life cycle of the program as well as the maintenance thereafter, and we kind of provide all the services that help integrate all of the discrete phases in the program or the project, as well as all the service providers that can help with the infrastructure and with the capital build.
Absolutely, it's one big team at the end of the day, because not one entity can carry it. So thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference and that you enjoy much success while you're here. Perhaps we can catch up with you before the end of the conference just to find out if there have been any developments and what your viewpoints are. Okay, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thanks very much.
To our viewers, thank you very much for joining us. Please remember that there are a number of interviews that we will be conducting throughout the 2 days of the conference. So feel free to tap on those and watch them. Thank you.